Hey, what's up out there, online community? And thanks for stopping by and checking out another segment of Straight No Chaser, where we talk sports and culture for fans all the time with the fans. Now, tonight I've got a very select group, and by select I mean a very special group, because we're here to talk about one of the most popular sports in America and across the world, professional wrestling, or as I like to say when I was coming up, pro wrestling. So tonight's panelists, tonight's guests, we've got Demetrius Payne, Steve Tortorelli, and Thomas O'Donnell. So before we get into our conversation, you know how we do. Raise your glasses. We're about to do our customary drink, our toast. Salute, gentlemen. We're about to get to a straight no chaser.
Salute.
So I want to start off first just with the brief introductions and background. Tom O'Donnell is here. He's got his own wrestling podcast called Catch, Hook, Shoot. And he's a huge sports fan, and he was able to translate that into a podcast and be able to have conversations about what it is he's passionate about. So, Tom, why don't you talk a little bit about what it is or how you got your passion, developed your passion for the sport, and what it is that you do is catch, hook, shoot.
Well, first of all, thanks, Stan, for having me on. It's a weird feeling being on this side of it, not being the host. But no, I've been a wrestling fan pretty much since I was about 5 years old, and I think it happened probably the same way it did for a lot of people in my age group. My first exposure to pro wrestling was seeing Hulk Hogan and Rocky III. And it just kind of snowballed from there. My mom was a wrestling fan growing up, and so shortly after that, she kind of introduced me to pro wrestling on TV and stuff like that. And I just became kind of an obsession. So, and I just, if wrestling was on, I wanted to watch it. And it's just grown over the years. And now, I wanted to be a wrestler so bad when I was a kid, but I'm not an athlete, not in any sense of the word. So, but then, as podcasting got so big, it's like, well, maybe I can do this. And it's, kind of a way for me to, put my 2 cents into the business. And it's just kind of, like I said, snowballed from there. And it's been awesome. There's, it's opened a lot of doors for me. I've met so many wrestlers, promoters, had, been able to interview some of my heroes, some current stars. And it's awesome. I love it.
Great. It's interesting that you said that your mom got you into wrestling. I became a wrestling fan because, believe it or not, my grandmother got me into wrestling.
Oh, wow.
Dorothy Lee Dixon, God bless her soul, rested in heaven. She took me to my very first wrestling match after she had already introduced me to the professional wrestling TV shows that included Dick the Bruiser, some of the other guys during that era in the AWA wrestling. My very first wrestling match that I attended was I call it U.S. Comiskey Park because the name keeps changing. But at the time, it was Comiskey Park. And we went to see the Road Warriors take on the Von Erichs, and Ric Flair was wrestling somebody. So that's how far we go back. So my very first wrestling match was with my grandmother. So it's very coincidental that you say your mom introduced you to wrestling.
That had to be in a Super Clash, right? Am I right?
It was actually after a baseball game. They set up the ring on home plate.
Oh, wow.
Look, wait, I see some laughter from the back section. Demetrius is giving me a couple chuckles in the third base gas face. But yeah, that was the first wrestling match that I went to. So, but it's interesting to hear you, Tom, talk about how you've been able to parlay that into being a fan to carrying forward something that you're actually passionate about and being able to, have this evolution of your status as a fan, and now that you're doing your own podcast. You mentioned that you've been able to meet some wrestlers, interview some wrestlers through your podcast endeavor. Are there wrestlers or a wrestler in particular that some of the people online would recognize by name, more mainstream wrestler?
Yeah, definitely the biggest one would be Mick Foley. I had a chance to do. I mean, it wasn't like a long form interview. It was at an event, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later because the promoter for that event is on here with us. But yeah, that was probably the high point of podcasting for me. It's WWE Hall of Famer. It's a guy that came up through the old territory system in world class and went into WCW and eventually WWE. And so that was just, I mean, I honestly, that is probably the only interview that I've had where literally my hand was shaking holding the microphone.
Yeah. I can only imagine what that feeling was like. And that was an in-person interview, not something done over call, correct?
Yeah, no, I was in person, face to face. I just the fact that he agreed to do it just to take 2 minutes out of his time because he had so many fans there to see him, that he took the time to come over to my table and talk to me. It was amazing.
Oh, great story. So Demetrius, I don't know if many people will be able to tell this from viewing it at home, but Demetrius, you're a huge wrestling fan, almost to the point that you think that you're holding a belt and up for challenges, if I'm not correct. If I'm looking at you, you're a huge wrestling fan. Talk about your passion and how you develop that in the sport.
Well, first and foremost, anybody who wants to challenge me are just people who want to lose. So just keep that in mind. But no, I very much like Tom, I got hooked at a very early age. I remember Thunder Lips in Rocky 3 and like I remember flipping through cable during the early days and seeing these two guys and they're in a ring, but it's not boxing. Why are they in the underwear? I don't understand. Yeah. But it was cool, and I really, really dug it. And I've just been hooked ever since. Being a fan is such a great source of escapism for me because professional wrestling is just it's an art. I call it an art more than I call it a sport. Because art makes you emote. It elicits an emotion from you. And anybody who's ever been to a show live, be it an indie show or a big WrestleMania show, you feel it. It's something about being in that atmosphere, and sometimes even translates when you're watching on TV. So I just always have on some merch. I always throw this belt over my shoulder when I walk into a meeting sometimes. And I'm like, do you not have one? Like, what? I don't understand the question. Professional wrestling is just a great world to get lost in sometimes, and I just love it. The older I get, even the harder it is as you get older to suspend your disbelief. For some reason, it just gets me more and more over the years. Just love it.
So let me ask you this. You walk into a meeting with the belt on. You walk into other places with the belt on. What's the response? What do people say when you walk into a room with a championship belt?
So you got to set the right tone, right? So you walk into a room with the suit on, with this belt over your shoulder. First thing out of your mouth, you got to say, the champ is here. And then you slam the belt on the table, and then you just sit down, lean back, and just look people in the eyes and see what happens. A lot of people try to avoid eye contact with you, but when you got one of these, it's impossible. That's it.
So I'm going to tell you, I would probably look to avoid eye contact with you as well. Now, is it safe to say that if you could have it, you would have theme music when you walked in the room, or do you already have that in place?
In my head, I already do, and it changes from time to time. It depends on the setting, but I always have some music going in my head. Depending on the situation, I might have a little Mr. McMahon walk. I might have a Stone Cold Steve Austin walk. It just kind of depends on the setting.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, you know what? It doesn't get more wrestling fan than that. Last but not least, I definitely want to welcome Steve Tortorelli to our show. He is based here in the Midwest. He's an independent wrestling promoter, and I definitely want to hear what he's got to say because he's got a lot of information, both as a fan, but then also as a wrestling business person. So, Steve, welcome to the show. Can you talk a little bit about your passion, what it is that you do, and the Wrestling Association that you help facilitate and oversee?
Absolutely. So again, my name's Steve. I run Warrior Wrestling, which is based in Chicago Heights, south of the city of Chicago, not too far from downtown. And like you guys, I began as a fan. I'm a couple years younger, so I became a fan during the Hulkamania era. And as a little kid, I remember it being, 1990, and I have had every wrestling action figure in my parents' basement. I had the Hogan that body slammed. I had the Hogan that punched. I had the Hogan that bear hugged. I had everybody else. I had the wrestling buddies, you name it. So I was a big 80s wrestling, rock and wrestling boom fan. And then I really fell out of it in the 90s. As I was growing up, wrestling wasn't that great in the US, and I wasn't paying as much attention. And I came back into it in 1998. Actually, some of my best friends have been wrestling fans for a long time, telling me about how cool it was, how much it had changed, and I really needed to get on the bandwagon, and I would just fight with them mercilessly until one day they're like, all right, sit down. We're showing you this pay-per-view we taped from last week. And the pay-per-view was the WWF King of the Ring 1998. Undertaker, Mankind, Hell in the Cell, Austin, Kane, First Blood, and I was just floored. It was like, Saul on the road to Damascus sees God in the sun and he becomes St. Paul. That was my moment. I felt like I was like, God was like, watch this Hell in a Cell match and see how great this is. So from then I was off to the races, became a huge fan, went to everything, WWF, WCW, ECW, local Chicago indies. In college, I drove all over to go to all the WrestleManias. I wrote my honors thesis on the history of pro wrestling. I ended up in LA teaching for a while. I trained in pro wrestling for a little. I was no good whatsoever. I trained for like 6 months, and came back to Chicago, started going to indie shows again, and I just had a passion to be involved in some way, shape, or form. So I sniffed around, maybe helping or being a part of some small indies. It never really took off until one of my best friends basically said, you know, you need to do this on your own. You need to just do it. And we did, and we ended up pairing the idea with the school where I work as principal. And so our shows double as a fundraiser for the school. So, you know, bar, concessions, parking, all of that goes back to the school for scholarships or student activities. And so I've got this weird dual life. I'm like Batman. I'm a high school principal during the day, and a wrestling promoter at night. But I'm living my best life, and I wouldn't trade a minute of it for anything.
That's awesome that you got this evolution of your life in wrestling, from a fan to incorporate into your educational part. You mentioned you wrote your thesis on it. You know, then you went and trained for professional wrestling. You know, now you're a wrestling promoter, and you're also using it as a business venture as well as fundraising. So I mean, you got the full gamut here. I feel like I'm talking to the Wizard of Oz right here. Like, you know, you just got everything all in one. So
you know, it was one of those things where it took 20 years of loving it for it to come together and actually start my own thing. But I've been such a nerd about it for so long that it's just built and built and built. You know, as Demetrius and I were talking before we went on the air, I can tell you about WrestleMania 8 like that. I can't tell you what I ate for breakfast this morning. I can tell you about the Macho Man. So,
yeah, you know, it's funny when you're passionate about a sport or something in life. Certain things around that subject matter become your reference point, your frame of reference as it relates to other things that happen or other events, or, you know, you know what you were doing on that day. You know, so you're able to have that recall, that memory. So kind of looking at that, I want to talk, Steve, you touched on it a little bit. I know many people are familiar, at least at some level, whether you've seen a commercial or whether it's through merchandising or just general conversation with professional wrestling from what we see on television. But I want to talk a little bit about the independent wrestling federations and things like that, because I think that's something that's more homogenized and organically grown on a local level, where you're able to possibly to develop relationships with some of the wrestlers and things like that, be a little more up close and personal. Steve, I'll start with you because you're actually a wrestling promoter here in Chicago Heights, which is not far from where I'm at. You're about 15 minutes away. Can you talk about kind of what you've seen as an independent promoter in terms of fan engagement, character development, things like that?
I think independent wrestling is one of my favorite things in the world. So I'm a big sports guy, and I really think every sport has its perfect medium. Like, I think baseball is best on the radio. I think there's nothing better than baseball on the radio. I think football is best on television because you can see 100 different angles that you can't see live. I think hockey and pro wrestling are best live because there is something live about those two things that does not come through the TV screen. It doesn't come through your computer screen. And I think that's what I love about independent pro wrestling is if you're not a fan of wrestling and your friends are going to an independent show at a bar, at a bingo hall, at a high school, you know what? Yeah, I'll pay $20. Why not? I'll do this. And then people get converted. Like I was reconverted in 1998. The energy, the closeness, the just people suspending their disbelief and becoming part of the show. There's nothing like that. And if you were a non-fan who went to a WWE event, you know, you might be sitting up in the 300s. It's a good show, but it's far away. You go to an indie event and you can hear one guy slap another guy. When there's a bump in the ring, you feel it shake. And the energy is real. And then you can talk to the guy after the show and say, hey, great job, great performance. I equate it to seeing an up-and-coming band at a local club. It's one thing to go see the Rolling Stones at Soldier Field. That's really cool. You're not going to meet Mick Jagger after the show. But if you see an up-and-coming band at a local club, not only did it feel more intimate, but you could actually have a personal interaction with the performer. Yes. So I think independent wrestling is the bee's knees, and it's my jam. It's why I put my love and passion into it.
Yes, I'm coming to your next show. The answer is yes.
Yes.
I love it. See, that's the type of feel and energy that me as a person who's familiar with the sport, but not necessarily a hardcore fan, that would draw me to it. That experience, that level of fan engagement, that level of intimacy. You know, while you're still there, you know, you can go to, like I said, a larger event, but it's similar to being at a concert at a 200-300 level or the mezzanine area. Whereas on a smaller circuit, you know, there's that intimacy, and like you said, you can have a conversation with someone, and you never know, this might be the person that, you know, elevates you. Say, hey, I saw that person when they were just starting out.
I real quick story, and sorry to dominate, but I went to a local Chicago indie several times in 2000, 2001, 2002. And the first local wrestler that I really liked at the Midlothian Rec Center or Tinley Park High School was this unknown, you know, scuzzy looking kid from Lockport named CM Punk. And the first t-shirt I ever bought is a CM Punk t-shirt from the LWF, the Lunatic Wrestling Federation in the South Suburbs of Chicago. Yeah. And so when CM Punk became CM Punk, it meant so much to me, not just because like, oh, a cool character is becoming a big deal, but like I shook that guy's hand at the Midlothian Rec Center when he was making $20 for the show. Yeah. So that is really a cool part of it.
It's how, you know what? So I'm back on the wrestling, but I only want to go to independent shows, you know, because I'm also, I can relate to the small band stories. Because again, you know, that's what it's about. It's that wow factor. It's that what drives you. You just doesn't feel like it's branded, packaged, and commercialized and just put out there for consumption. So, man, thanks for sharing, Steve. Tom, you've got a similar story, but you're a wrestling fan. You've gone to major wrestling events. You've also gone to independent events. Kind of compare and contrast the two, and which do you prefer, and how do they differ?
I think Steve actually put it perfectly, comparing it to like a concert in a huge arena to, you know, a small or a lesser known band in a bar. It's two totally different worlds. I mean, yeah, they're both pro wrestling, but that's where similarities end. Because, and I'm going to use Warrior as an example because I've been to, you know, they're the ones that I've been to the most shows for. I've gotten to interact with so many wrestlers, and, you know, we're not talking like just, you know, green rookies that nobody's ever heard of. I mean, Steve gets some big name talent at Warrior, but you know, you, like you said, you get the opportunity to interact with them. You get to sit a hell of a lot closer than you do at like Allstate Arena or the United Center or something like that. You know, there's no such thing as a bad seat at an indie event unless maybe you're a little kid that gets sat behind a tall guy. But you know, other than that, and you know, you're pretty much like right on top of the action. I mean, the last Warrior show, I was actually doing a live broadcast for the podcast because Steve's nice enough to let me do live play-by-play. And but I mean, their women's champion got slammed into my table. Where else is that going to happen?
I do have a question. Does that come out of your security deposit or Steve's security deposit?
Nothing got broken, thank God. But
everyone's just crossing their fingers. Nothing breaks.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, it was a sturdy plastic, you know, table, so it wasn't going anywhere. But like I said, that's not going to happen at the Allstate Arena. You know, if I'm at Allstate, I'm lucky if I can see them like this big from my seat up in the 200 section.
Yeah.
You know, so that really is the biggest difference, is you feel and you are a lot closer to the action, a lot closer to the wrestlers, and there is that opportunity to actually interact with them, and most of them, well, in my case, all of them, any wrestlers that I've interacted with, I've never had a bad interaction with the wrestler. They welcome it. They're very welcoming. All of them, you know, that I've ever dealt with are very, very nice people. They think nothing to shake your hand, sign an autograph, take a picture. And you don't get those kind of opportunities at like a WWE event. It just doesn't happen.
Gotcha.
So if I had to pick, like if it was going on the same day or something, somebody says, hey, I got tickets to this WWE house show, or I got tickets to Warrior Wrestling, I'm going to Warrior. Just because it's a better, to me, it's a more enjoyable time. Going to a WWE show is kind of like going to a movie. You're going to sit there, you're going to watch, you're going to go home. You know, going to an independent show, sorry, hit the mic. Going to an independent show, you're still going to sit there and watch, but you're also going to get the chance to interact. There's more. It's a much more intimate crowd. There's more chance to interact with your fellow fans, and it's just a much more, to me, a much better time.
Gotcha. Very well stated. Demetrius, how about you?
Oh, very much the same. Going to an indie show, seeing some guy who was probably on working the docks at Amazon somewhere on Friday, doing a show on Saturday, either just because he needs a few extra bucks or he just really loves it. That's great. You get a lot of kids there at indie shows, a lot of family, great family atmosphere. And then for someone like me, I'm a heckler. That's my contribution to the show.
You?
And
no.
True story. True story. I know. It's kind of hard to believe. You got to bring a championship belt to a budget meeting. Would want to be part of an indie show, but when you're yelling from the cheap seats at Allstate, all you're doing is just annoying the people around you, which I'm okay with. But when you're yelling from third row at an MLW show or something like that, your voice is being heard. And I feel like I'm getting my money's worth. And then afterwards, like everybody said, afterwards you can go up to their table, shake their hand, tell them what a great match. It really is incredible. If I think Tom and Steve said they both trained to be wrestlers. I never trained to be a wrestler, but I have gotten in a ring or two. All you got to do is take one bump, and the fact that these men and women do this for little to no pay, but they're doing it to entertain me and everybody else in attendance, that really heightened my experiences to know that these guys and these gals, a lot of whom are doing it for little to no money, are just trying to entertain me. They dig it. They're in there because they have fun, but they want to see me and everybody else in attendance be entertained. Baseball players and professional athletes like that make hundreds of millions of dollars, and God bless them. But this guy, this gal who's doing this job for a hot dog and a handshake, they really get my appreciation. Indie shows are the best.
Well, it's interesting that you touched on that, because the consistent theme is that while the professional, the quote unquote professional, I should say, the more mainstream, let me put it that way, the more mainstream wrestling shows have a larger audience. The independent show has a better experience for fans overall, in terms of level of engagement, intimacy, the ability to interact, things like that. Each of you have been to, or each of you in some way have been involved with an independent show. What is the level of hecklers, or the level of interaction among hecklers and wrestlers? Because that's something that, because you have that intimacy. And if you're like me, like when I was playing other sports, I had rabbit ears, so I could hear any and everything. I don't care if you're in the first row or the 30th row, I could hear any and everything. But have you seen where maybe a heckler's gone too far and the situation has gotten out of hand, or maybe a heckler has like said something really hilarious and the wrestler broke character because it was so funny and they just kind of reacted to it? Steve, why don't you talk about that? Because I think you being a promoter.
Well, I the moment you started saying this question, one thing came into mind. 2010, I was in Los Angeles, and it was a PWG show, but not in their usual arena. It was part of a bigger wrestling convention. It was in a hotel ballroom. And Kevin Steen, who would go on to become Kevin Owens in WWE, was having a match with somebody. It might have been Chris Hero. And some guy in the audience was heckling Kevin Steen. And Steen, if you've ever listened to him, been around him, he's just super quick, super smart, super funny, does not take any crap. So some guy's heckling him in the audience, and Steen is heckling the guy back. And in the middle of the match, Steen would like hit a body slam, talk trash to the guy. Do something else, talk trash to the guy. He did it for the entire match. Like 15 minutes. He just kept going back and forth with this guy in the audience. And then he won the match and like stared the guy down and walked off. And the guy was not a plant. It was just some drunk dude in the audience. The greatest things I've ever seen.
See, that's something that I would love, I would love to be a part of, because that would also be me, so I can relate to the heckling experience. But, that's a great story, because I can see that. Demetrius, how about you?
I was at an indie show. One of the great things about indie shows is when you can see, I don't want to see guys past their prime, but you see some guys that you saw on WWE for years, and now they're working a gym in Markham, Illinois somewhere. and it was Alberto Del Patron, I think is what he goes by, outside of WWE, and he was fighting MVP. Both two guys who were in WWE, and now they're working. It was a packed show, but definitely was not all state. And I was just giving MVP the business because I saw him. I saw him like smashing a Subway sandwich maybe 30 minutes before the show or something. So I'm giving him all this grief. The action rolls out of the ring. I was in first, second row. Alberto whips MVP basically onto me. And I don't know if it was because I was talking so much stuff, but here I got this 230-pound sweaty man thrown on me. And I ain't gonna lie, I got knocked back and it hurt, but it was the greatest night of my life. It was fantastic.
Did you have your belt on in the crowd?
Huh?
Did you have your belt on in the crowd? Did he
I did have my belt on in the crowd, and I didn't spill my beer. I'm very proud to say that. Didn't spill my beer.
That's a win-win. You held on to the belt, you held on to your beer. So that's a win-win.
Yes, sir.
Tom, how about you?
Honestly, mine, I don't know if you necessarily, if I can talk, call it heckling, but there was this one group of people, and I've seen them at multiple events. I've seen them at a Warrior show, and I saw them shortly thereafter at an Impact show that I went to. It was Impact's, their big event of the year, Bound for Glory. They had it at, was it the Odeum? I think it was.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And the same group of people was there. I don't know if they're a family or if they're just like a group of musicians, but it was, they bring drums and noisemakers. It's very like Lucha Libre. It's a Lucha Libre tradition is what it is. And, Steve gets a lot of Lucha stars for Warrior. So, they were out for that and they were, playing all the different beats and the crowd was loving it. The wrestlers were loving it. They, you had like Pentagon and Phoenix up on the ropes, pointing at them, telling them to keep playing and stuff like that. And, Brian Cage, who was the Warrior champion at the time, his thing is, the Terminator clap, they call it. And these guys are playing out on the drum for him. And same thing at the Impact event a few weeks later. And, it was just a lot of, interaction between the wrestlers and this group that was there. So I thought that was really cool. And again, that's something you don't see at, WWE stuff.
Yeah, and I think for and I think to have this conversation is good because for many fans that aren't necessarily into the sport hardcore, but have a passing interest or just enjoy it, but aren't what we consider hardcore fans, they really don't understand what the independent experience could be like. It's similar to, for lack of a better term, going to a minor league baseball game versus a professional baseball game, where you're able to have those conversations with people afterwards, besides monographs. It's just a different feel. And I think this will help just grow the sport on the local level because a lot of people can't afford to go to some of the mainstream wrestling events and things like that, whether it be finances or location to see certain wrestlers. So this definitely offers another alternative for those people that are still interested in the sport. So with that, let me ask you guys, what makes for a good wrestling character? First, Demetrius, as a fan, what makes for a good wrestling character that you can get behind or that you can go against? What defines that character? What are some characteristics that you look for?
I really look for the guys and gals who really kind of believe it. Like you can tell, we live in a day and age where we know all the wrestlers' real names and we know their backgrounds, we know all this stuff. So when you're on TV, for whenever that red light is on and you're on TV, I want to believe whatever it is you're saying. Talking about how great you are, how much the other person sucks, whatever it is, the more you believe it, the more I believe it, the more I care. I really like the wrestlers who like to be hated. So we call them the heels, the bad guys. Guys that really just, I almost get physically ill when you come on my screen. I'm so sick of you. You're so annoying. In my opinion, that's a skill to just be, to be such a dick and really own it. That's awesome. And we all like to be liked, right? So for you to really buy in and to be so devoted to being just an asshole, it's awesome. Those are my favorite characters.
So let me ask you kind of a follow up to that. Has there ever been a wrestler that you have despised so much because of his character that you forgot that that's a real person and it's hard for you to separate who's the wrestler and who's the wrestling. I'm sorry, who's the wrestling character and who's the individual, realizing that this person may not be that way?
One of my first shows that I ever went to, my dad took me to his show. The main event, I'll never forget it was at the old UIC arena. And I don't even think that's even there anymore. But the main event was Junkyard Dog and Andre the Giant tag teaming against Big John Studd and Ken Patera. And I'll never forget
way back.
Fantastic match. But before that match, what I'll never forget was Roddy Piper fought, I don't even remember who he fought. What I do remember was me at I was probably 8 years old trying to climb over the barricade to get to Roddy Piper because he had me so mad because he was beating the crap out of somebody just relentlessly. I remember at 8 years old, my dad trying to restrain me to get me. And what would have happened if I'd have gotten over that railing? That's what I think of all the time. If I'd have gotten over that, what would have happened?
Let's just say you wouldn't be sitting here holding that belt. How about that?
Probably not. I would not be the champ.
Yeah. Steve, how about you? Has there been a character, both as a fan, but then also as a promoter, where you said, man, God, this guy's just too damn good. I have to realize this is a wrestling character and not the person.
I don't know that I've ever had somebody where I couldn't separate the two. There are definitely wrestlers that I've loved even more because they're such a good human, and wrestlers I've hated even more because they're not a great human. So, for example, like Randy Orton is legendarily an a-hole. And that's his character on the screen, but that's who he is in real life. He's destroyed hotel rooms. He's rude to people. You know, when I was 16 years ago, when I was younger and we'd try to get autographs after a show, he was rude to a whole bunch of kids at the time. You know, like that's a guy who the character is the person. And that makes the character even better because you really believe that character. And I think the flip side of that is there are some characters who are so good at being evil, and they usually tend to be the nicest person in the world.
Yes.
You know, so like on our shows, for example, Tessa Blanchard is just a stone cold bee. Like she's this ice woman. She's a badass. She's whatever. The sweetest human being I've ever met in my life backstage. Polite to everybody, helps push in chairs, you know, always asking people like, can I help with something? Like just a very sweet person. She walks through the curtain and she's ice. And so you know, it kind of breaks the character a little bit, but I know more people who are evil, but are wonderful humans than I've ever gotten carried away thinking they were really evil.
Gotcha. Yeah. Tom, how about you?
I gotta say, when I was a kid, that person for me was Randy Savage. When he was a heel, like before WrestleMania 3, when he took out Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, I hated him. Ricky Steamboat was one of my favorite wrestlers, and Macho Man hurt him, and he made it so believable. Yeah, I see the shirt. But he made it so believable that he just hated Steamboat so much and wanted to hurt him and put him out of wrestling forever, and I believed it. I mean, I was, 8 years old or something like that, so, you know, but then you know, so I couldn't at that age, I mean, obviously I couldn't separate the person from the character, but you know, now it's like my all-time favorite wrestler is The Undertaker. And one of the main reasons for that is because this is a guy who lived his gimmick for 30 years, never broke character, didn't do shoot interviews or real interviews, whatever you want to call them, you know, out of character until this year is when he really started doing interviews as himself, as Mark Calloway. You know, prior to that, it was The Undertaker. You saw him out in public somewhere, he's still dressed all in black, sunglasses, and, you know, he's The Undertaker 24/7. So I you know, that gives me a lot of respect, that level of dedication to his craft, that he just, like I said, lived it for like 30 years. So, but I think in modern wrestling, somebody who really blurs that line, and I'm not even sure if it's a blurred line because I've never met the guy, is MJF.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I've never met him in person. I've been in the same room with him. I didn't speak to him because I just didn't want to. But he just comes off as such, excuse the phrase, such a dick to
Yeah.
everybody, men, women, children, doesn't matter. He does not discriminate. He treats everybody like crap. And he does it on social media. He does it in person. The guy does not break character. So it makes it very hard to tell, is that him or is he just that dedicated to his character? I don't know.
Yeah, well, but that's part of having a great character and great character development.
Yeah,
The lines
man.
are blurred.
That's why they call him being a pro. You know, you really got to believe it. It's like we were saying, like the more you can believe it, whether it's Tessa Blanchard when she walks through the curtain, MJF if he's awake, or 8-year-old me and Roddy Piper. You know, when you believe it, that's just the best.
So I'm gonna side with Demetrius on this. One of the wrestlers that I despised growing up was Roddy Piper. I mean, it was like and you don't know any better at a younger age, you know, so you wish all kind of evil things on him, or, you know, you just have no goodwill for him. But that just goes to show how great of a character he was, and the fact that he was able to remain in character and really sell it, because that's the huge part of it. It's a little different now because, as been mentioned, you know, we have access. We have access to their information, their date of birth, their finances, their background, all those things. So it's even more of a challenge now to sell it. Because people kind of know your backstory. It's almost as if you're, you know, an entertainer claiming to be, you know, involved in a gang or coming up in a rock and roll or whatever the case may be, and they know that you're from the suburbs or you went to private school, things like that. So it's even a more difficult challenge to sell characters now. Let me ask you, who are the must-see characters now? Because we talked about what makes a great character. Who are the must-see characters? I want to maybe go with a couple mainstream characters and then some lesser-known characters on the independent circuit that we may not have heard of. And you said, wow, you know what? When you come to an independent show, you're going to get a great show. So let's start with Tom. Who's some must-see characters in mainstream wrestling, but then also a couple that you would say as independent wrestlers?
Mainstream right now, and it's still kind of hard to say because right now mainstream obviously means WWE. They don't have that one big star that they've always had in, you know, generations past. But, you know, some that I would say are close to that level is one would have to be Charlotte Flair, Ric Flair's daughter. She's pretty much the top of WWE right now. Another one that I really like in WWE is Drew McIntyre. He's the WWE champion currently and just a very, very talented guy. And if I got to pick one more, probably Bray Wyatt. He is like his current character, like he's had a couple different characters since he's been in WWE. The one he's got right now is the hottest one that he has had because it's like a split personality thing. He's got like this kind of demented Mr. Rogers type character, but then he flips the switch and he turns into this other character called the Fiend with like a Slipknot mask and just violent and brutal, and it's just very cool. So those would be the ones that I think you would really want to look at in mainstream. As far as independence, I gotta say Tessa Blanchard. She is one of my favorite wrestlers in the world right now. She, you know, like Steve said, just an amazing person to meet behind the scenes. I have had the pleasure to meet her and talk to her for a second or two. In the ring, there is not too many people that can touch her as far as in-ring skills go. And she's another second-generation star. Her dad was Tully Blanchard from the Four Horsemen.
Yep.
And, you know, her stepdad was Magnum TA. So she's got she's got the background. And then another one is a guy that's in AEW right now named Brian Cage, also a former Warrior Wrestling champion. But he's one, like, I've watched him for a very long time. The first like national exposure he got was on a show called Lucha Underground. And, you know, he moved from there to Impact Wrestling to now he's in AEW. And just to watch him evolve and watch his just overall skill set evolve, and physically the guy's a monster. So he's one that I think I already consider him a huge star just because I'm a wrestling fan and I, you know, follow all this stuff, but he's one that I think definitely could be, you know, at some point a mainstream name. So independently, those would probably be my top two.
Do you think that the wrestlers that you name are someone that could carry the belt, that could, at some point evolve into being the person that, well, right now we know the Charlotte Flair is probably the biggest draw. But some of the other names that you mentioned, do you think those wrestlers could carry the belt, could carry the moniker, could be the brand ambassador, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, if I had to pick one to say, you know, this could be the next Hulk Hogan, just as a reference point, you know, I would probably say right now Drew McIntyre in WWE, because he checks all the boxes, the ring skills, the personality, the charisma, the drawing power, the fans love him, you know, all that kind of stuff. So he, you know, right now at this point in wrestling, I think he would be your best bet as far as that goes.
Okay, great. Steve, how about you?
I'll pick so I agree with all of Tom's, but I'm not going to duplicate him. I also agree with MJF was mentioned earlier. I think he's on that list. I'm going to pick a few characters.
I mentioned him and I forgot about him.
Yeah. I'm going to pick a few characters that stand out because they're just completely different and amazing. So I'll start with, in AEW, Pentagon and Phoenix. And they've been on our shows a couple of times. They're luchadors, got their start in Lucha Underground, the TV series from a few years back. And there's something about them, and I work with tons of luchadors, right? And many are amazing. Pentagon's character is just perfect. He's basically like the Day of the Dead personified, like Mexican sugar skull paint on his face with a really scary mask over his face. He is just, the character is perfect. It's a perfect character. And his real life brother, Phoenix, his tag team partner, is probably the most impressive athletic wrestler in the world today. So in this two set of brothers who are a tag team, you have one of the best characters and one of the best athletes. And when you've seen them once, you know who they are. They're burned in your mind. You know, you might see a lot of other wrestlers. This guy's got trunks. This guy's got pants. There's some other luchadors. The show's over. I don't really remember. When you've seen Pentagon and Phoenix, you remember them. They are very memorable. So I'll say them for AEW. And then for WWE, there's a guy who is not being pushed right now. He's actually being kind of de-pushed, but he could be one of the guys to carry the water and be the face of the brand. A guy named Ricochet, who is a younger guy, incredible athlete. I mean, the guy can absolutely fly. He has a lot of natural charisma. He's the kind of guy where if given the ball, he could run with it. So mainstream, I will say Ricochet in WWE, Pentagon and Phoenix in AEW. Independent scene, there's a lot of guys that we've had. Brian Pillman Jr. is special. He's our current champ, and he's our champ for a reason. The kid has every non-measurable, every X factor. He's got it. Charisma, likability. You see him get the crap kicked out of him in the ring, and you feel bad for him. You just like the guy, and that you cannot teach. You can be an incredible technical wrestler, but you can't teach connection with the audience. Yeah. So I'd say Brian Pillman on the independents. And there's also two up-and-coming guys who are really weird characters, but they own it and it works. One is called Warhorse. He's basically a metalhead dude with face paint, and he wears all denim, and he's headbanging, and he cuts these crazy promos. The other one is named Danhausen, and he's basically like a metrosexual vampire. And he has these weird, goofy promos, and he walks to the ring with a jar of human teeth, and he dances to the Pee Wee Herman tequila dance. And it's super weird, and it makes no sense until you see it and you go, this works. I don't know why it works, but it works.
Yeah.
So those are the guys I would say.
I think you hit on something in the fact that it works for them. And, you know, being a fan, but then also being a promoter, one of the things that you guys have touched on is having that it factor. You can't really measure it, you can't really describe it, but you know it when you see it. And I think that's where the connection comes in. And I think that's what makes for a good character and character development and longevity as well. You know, you talked about it. So it's great to hear about that. And also to familiarize myself with some of the more up-and-coming independent wrestlers, because I would like to go to some of the shows. I had a couple buddies that did some independent wrestling, Tony and Ivan, you know, and they would have character and they discuss different ideas and things like that. So to hear how these characters grow and evolve, it's tremendous. So good job. Demetrius, how about you?
Here's a guy, and I'll start with WWE because that's kind of the gateway drug for all of us for wrestling is WWE. So, there's a guy in WWE who I would pay to watch get beat up, and that's Baron Corbin. He's as hateable a human being as you would ever, hateable as a character as you'd ever want to see, and he just owns it. And the more heat he gets, the more boos and the more vitriol that gets sent his way, he just turns it up even more. And I really like about I really do get upset when I see him on my screen. I'm like, oh. And so I would pay money to see him get beat up.
Okay.
So that's one. There's another guy. I won't know what I'd classify him as an indie guy, but he's never, to the best of my knowledge, been employed by a wrestling promotion here in the States full time. His name is Will Ospreay. He is a young man from the United Kingdom. He works primarily in Japan, and their style of wrestling, you could do a whole nother podcast just on Japanese wrestling and the difference between that and what we get mostly here in the States. But he is incredible. Steve was talking about Ricochet. He's over in WWE. Will Ospreay is kind of like, almost like his mirror image. They have very similar athleticism. Incredibly, they just both exude charisma, and they do stuff in the ring that you've never seen before. If anybody listening to this, YouTube Will Ospreay versus Ricochet. They've had several matches over the years.
Wow.
And they'll do stuff that you will not soon forget. And this guy is definitely independent. I saw him on an MLW show. I believe his name is Jonathan Fatu. Tom, Steve, that name ring any bells?
Yeah.
Yeah. He is a Samoan descent. I don't know what his correlation is. I feel like, I hate to generalize, but I just feel like if you're Samoan descent, you're going to be linked to The Rock and the Wild Samoans and everything else, right or wrong.
They pretty much are, except for Samoa Joe.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Jonathan too is like, he's an enormous human being who can move like somebody a third of his size. It's kind of weird to see. I saw him in LA Park is what he goes by now, tear it up at MLW's first pay-per-view taping. So Jonathan Fatu is the name to keep an eye out for. YouTube some Will Ospreay stuff. You won't regret it. And Baron Corbin, like, honestly, if I saw him, if he like walked outside my door out right now, I'd probably run outside and try to hit him. He's just so annoying, but he owns it. That's
so when you say, they do some spectacular stuff, like what is it about their performance? Is it the character? Is it the moves? Kind of what is it that makes it so eye-catching or eye-popping for you?
For me, it's performance art, right? Like we all know, for the most part, what's going on and what we're watching. And for them to make it look really believable, you got to hurt yourself. And these men and women do it over and over and over and over and over again, just to entertain me. And it's pretty amazing. It's one of the things I like to say. Like, you can't. It doesn't really matter who wins or loses for me as a fan. It's about the effort. It's about the story that you're telling in the ring and the effort that you put into telling it. That's what really gets me sucked in, and that's what makes for a good match for me. At the end of the day, it's protagonist, antagonist, and they are at conflict for something. Whatever that something is, sometimes doesn't even matter. But that old story told over and over and over and over and over again has had me a fan for 35 plus years.
I think you touched on something, and it kind of segues into a question. We have people that have been viewing, and we're streaming on multiple social media, multiple Facebook pages. Ken Brown, who's one of the biggest supporters on Straight No Chase, I've had him on for a couple different segments. He's asked a question, and I think Demetrius, you touched on it. Is sometimes you have to really go all out, and going all out, you may injure yourself or kind of stretch things to the limit. Is there a wrestler that you think, or can you name a wrestler who you think their career has been cut short due to injury? That's one of the questions that's been asked.
Well, Tom interviewed him. Mick Foley, he's probably the poster child of that exact question. The fact that he can move at all, like the fact that he's not in a wheelchair, is amazing to me. Mick Foley has literally, not figuratively, literally given his body so that Tom, myself, Steve, and anybody who's ever paid money to see him wrestle can be like, oh, that Mick Foley. Mick Foley is the poster child for that.
Yeah. And Demetrius just mentioned Will Ospreay. Osprey is slowing down a little bit now. He's put on weight. He's become a heavyweight, but he was a light heavyweight in Japan for years. And regularly, the wrestling reviewers and critics have said, this kid is unbelievable, one of the most talented in the world, but if he doesn't change his style, he's not going to be able to wrestle after the age of 32, 33, because he was flying out of the ring and falling on his head, getting thrown everywhere, and he's changed his style. But had he not, we wouldn't be talking about him for a long time. He would be done pretty quickly.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Tom, how about you?
One that honestly, I'm kind of surprised he is still wrestling because all the chances he takes is Jeff Hardy. I mean, the guy, me and Jeff Hardy are the same age. And to see the stuff that he's doing, I look at it, it's like my neck would be broken. My hip would be broken. I mean, so, but as far as somebody that's had their career cut short because of their wrestling style, I would say Daniel Bryan, even though he has come back in the last couple of years, he did have to retire because of concussion issues. And he was out for, what was it, about 3 years or so before he was finally medically cleared to come back. But, and he had to, one thing he had to do was change up his style a little bit because he was a smaller guy. So he tends to get thrown around a lot. And obviously that leads to concussions. So that'd probably be the one, I'm glad he was able to come back because as far as just pure in-ring skill goes, he's another one. He's pretty much untouchable.
So Tom, kind of piggybacking off of that, you're a wrestling fan, you've got a podcast, you've been able to interview wrestlers, you've seen wrestling up close. What's the first thing that comes to mind that you want to say to the novice fan that says, well, wrestling is fake? It's no one gets hurt. No one, it's all scripted. What's the first thought that comes to mind when you hear that?
If they're saying fake in the sense that, like you said, they don't think anybody gets hurt, I show them that match from King of the Ring 98 with Undertaker and Mick Foley, where Mick Foley gets thrown off the top of a 16-foot high cage through a table onto a concrete floor. I'm sorry, props don't stop you from getting hurt. Yeah. Just because I hate the word fake when it comes to wrestling. I honestly do. But, is it scripted? Are the storylines scripted? Yes. Are the outcomes of the matches predetermined? Yes. It's not, it's not a sport in the sense that it's an actual competition. But those guys in the ring, they are athletes. Yes. They're putting their bodies on the line. That ring is not a trampoline. I've been inside a wrestling ring. That ring is steel and wood, with a little bit of canvas over the wood. So, it's not the popular saying is it's not ballet. It definitely isn't, so just watch, all I can say is watch and you tell me how is that, fake what they're doing. I mean, yeah, it's not a competition, but by no means is what's happening in that ring fake.
And the best analogy I've ever heard is, and I actually think it came from Triple H in WWE, it's like Cirque du Soleil. Like there are characters, there are stories, there are colors, it's presentational. You might like some of it, not like some of it, but you're never going to watch Cirque du Soleil and walk away not being totally mesmerized by the athleticism and the danger. And that's the same thing with wrestling. It's Cirque du Soleil.
Yeah, and I
feel like when people say fake, I feel like people who say that probably when they were a kid really thought it was real, and now they're mad that they got duped. Because, but the reality of it is, at least definitely in our lives, wrestling has never purported itself to be anything it's not. From like 1980 till now, wrestling has been sports entertainment, and they've called it as such for the most part over that time span. So wrestling has never pretended to be something it isn't. Whether you chose to believe it was something it isn't, that's up to you as the fan. Plus, you can't fake impact. Like Tom was saying, you can't fake impact. Does wrestler A know wrestler B is going to pick him up and slam him onto a table or onto a concrete floor? He probably knows it's going to happen, but that's not going to make it hurt less. So you just can't fake impact. And lastly, the emotion that is in a room when you go to an event, indie show, WrestleMania, anything in between, you see the kids having fun. You see, overserved guys like me heckling the wrestlers. You can't fake those kind of emotions, that kind of reality, for me, that's as real as it gets. So when people use the word fake, I just got to scratch my head because it's like, but it's not. You might have thought it was something else once, but it's not fake.
And I use the term fake, not to disrespect the sport, but that's the conversation and the terminology that the lay fan will often utilize when you talk about wrestling and have those conversations. They will say, oh, this wrestling is fake or wrestling is scripted and things like that. So it's not to disrespect the sport. It's mainly to, utilize the lingo and then the language in which the lay fan will use. So with that, because we know impact, like you said, doesn't hurt any less. You have to be a great athlete to have a great character and have a great experience and career longevity for professional wrestling. And then also you have to have a certain level of toughness because you have to be able to get back up after having sudden impact, after having some very tough matches. Let me ask you, who would you say are legitimate tough guys? Who are real tough guys that you would say outside the ring, yeah, this person's a real badass? Like for me, I looked at a guy, and I'm going way back. I looked at a guy like Bruiser Brody, and I'm like, that's the guy I don't want to mess with. A buddy of mine, he lived in Stone Park, and after the WWF matches, there was a all-night bar called the Stay Out in Stone Park, where a lot of guys would go after the matches, and Francois Wright, shout out to Francois Wright, he wasn't able to be on the show tonight, but he said that he was in the Stay Out, and some of the guys were drinking. It was Arn Anderson and Lex Luger, some other guys. They're just having a good time. And one of the guys in this group got into a disagreement with Arn Anderson over a young lady. And my buddy Francois Wright, he's 6'5", all of 230, 240 pounds as a basketball player, but he's not a small guy. But he talks about, I made a business decision to diffuse the situation because I'm not taking on Arn Anderson because that's a legit, real tough guy. That's a badass. So, you hear these stories about, some people are in character, but this is also who they are as a person. Is there a wrestler, either independent or mainstream wrestling, WWE, AEW, that you say, wow, that's a legit badass that I'm not going to mess with outside the ring? I don't want to catch him in the bar or talk trash to him because there's nothing between us but air and opportunity, and I'm not trying to close that distance. Is there a wrestler? Let's start with Tom, and then we'll go Steve, and then Demetrius.
Well, I mean, going back a little bit, there's so many stories in pro wrestling about this one particular guy who nobody will screw with, and his name is Ming, or he was known as Haku.
Yes. Oh, yes.
He was like a legit badass, and like nobody wanted to mess with him. I mean, there are stories about him literally ripping a guy's teeth out of his head in a bar fight because he said wrestling was fake. And stuff like that. And another one was a little bit further back was Harley Race.
Yes,
a legit tough guy. I mean, Harley Race, as the story goes, as Bobby Heenan would tell it, one of the only guys that Andre the Giant was afraid of. So if Andre's afraid of the guy, I'm definitely not going to screw with him. But in today's wrestling, I mean, I think the obvious one is Brock Lesnar, because he was a legit MMA fighter, UFC champion. So I'm not thinking anybody's going to physically want to mess with him. But I don't know, because you don't hear about wrestlers being tough guys outside the ring anymore because of stuff like social media and because it will spread like wildfire. So, you don't hear those stories really too much anymore. Another one is Mick Foley. This is a guy that got his ear ripped off and finished the match. So, outside of Brock Lesnar, just because of his MMA background, I'd have a hard time, picking somebody from the current crop of wrestlers just because news spreads too fast for any of that kind of stuff to go on.
It's interesting that you mentioned Haku because, again, I call him my big brother, Francois Wright. He talks about, that was the guy you didn't want to mess with. There were so many stories, and, everybody's not lying. And everybody had a story that it just sounded so unbelievable that, God, this is almost too believable. Because who would make these types of things up? So absolutely. So you're not the only one. Steve, how about you?
Demetrius mentioned Japan earlier. I will go overseas to a New Japan star who actually was on a show for us this past December. His name is Minoru Suzuki.
Okay.
And Suzuki was a big star in New Japan Pro Wrestling. And then in the early to mid 90s, he stepped away from wrestling to be one of the pioneers of MMA in Japan, an organization called Pancrase, which was one of the front runners before UFC and before all this. So he was a badass in wrestling. He went into MMA, has a ridiculous winning record in MMA, and then has come back into wrestling. And he did both in the early 2000s, and now he's been mostly just wrestling from 2010 onward. But
Okay.
he's 52 years old now, and everyone has this unbelievable respect for him because he is such a badass. And quick story, Tom Lawler, Filthy Tom Lawler, who's a former UFC fighter and an independent pro wrestler. He's on a bunch of our shows too. Awesome guy. It's been Tom's dream to fight Minoru Suzuki. Well, they got to have the fight in our December show. And from the audience's perspective, it was a bloodbath. I mean, just forearms and smashes and whatever. And we're watching it backstage like, oh God, we're gonna have to take Tom to the hospital. And I remember talking to Tom after the show, and I said, so Tom, how was it? Are you standing? He goes, I never got touched. He said, Suzuki is such a physical specimen and so good at real combat and pro wrestling that he could make the promoters think that Tom got murdered.
Wow.
And Tom didn't feel a thing. And that just shows you how good of a real badass he is and how much control he has of his body. Like, I think about like Bruce Lee, if you guys are Bruce Lee fans. And one of the most impressive things about Bruce Lee was not his strength, his speed, it was his control.
Yeah.
And that's what I think about with this guy named Minoru Suzuki. So if you've never heard of him, go look him up. Total badass.
And it sounds like having that level of professional skill provides a laser focus. So he knows just how far to go. And like you said, it's concentrated and controlled. Wow, that's a phenomenal story. Demetrius, how about you?
I love that story, Steve.
I know.
That's what I call pro shit. There's a reason why Suzuki's been making money for 20, 30 years, and there's kids who'll kill themselves in their backyard with nobody watching and think they're doing something. That is the level between, you know, some guys rolling around, some guys whatever, and then there's that pro stuff. That's I love that. And a lot like Tom, I'm having a hard time trying to think of in the post kayfabe era that we're in, like real tough guys. Back in the day, you know, wrestling on TV is always, well, definitely back in the 80s, wrestling on TV was a big old infomercial, like a regional infomercial. We're having this show at your town on this day, and so we're hyping it up on TV. And then after TV, a lot of these guys would go into the local pubs and bars and whatever and start beating guys up to kind of boost their street cred or whatever, and that would lead to sometimes to people going to shows. And now we live in this day and age where that's not even really prudent anymore. So you don't really see that so much the tough guy in today's performers. But I've probably gotten into a Google hole when it comes to Ming stories that are just, you could literally spend all day just Googling Ming stories, how a cop pepper sprayed him and he just opened his mouth and took it like it was like it was.
Oh, wow. Unbelievable.
Right, like he just gargled it or something, like ripping somebody's nose off in a bar fight, just all kinds of stuff you hear about him. And to let him tell it, it was always in defense of his friends. It wasn't to prove a point. It was just protecting the business and protecting his friends. So Ming would probably be my all-time, like, legit tough guy. But also kind of like what Steve said, there's a guy out now named Bobby Lashley. And he was in professional wrestling and mixed martial arts at the same time, which just blows my mind that anybody could pull that off. Had a really impressive record in mixed martial arts while keeping up a full-time professional wrestling schedule. So I don't know if that makes him, you know, if nothing else, that makes him mentally tough than most other people.
Yeah, that's huge to be able to do both. And just a couple more pieces, and I appreciate everyone, you know, taking the time to have conversation. I want to piggyback off of that, and that is, you know, right now you've got mixed martial arts, you've got UFC, you've got a lot of guys that are playing, you know, professional football. Do you think that because you have a number of these individuals going into other sports, that is potentially hurt or limited the talent pool for professional wrestlers, in your opinion? Your thoughts on that? We'll start with Demetrius, and I'll go Steve, and then Tom.
I just give a lot of respect to anybody who because everything you just mentioned, from mixed martial arts, pro wrestling, football, those are like collision sports. They're not contact sports. They're collision sports, and you can go from one to the other. Anybody willing to do that, that's got to be kind of nuts. But it's also really admirable that you would want to do that. I don't know that how it affects the talent pool for professional wrestling, especially now. WWE has their own farm system, if you will, of grooming future talent. And the indie, even though the whole world's kind of got the pause button pressed, the indie system will always keep lifeblood into professional wrestling. You're always going to have guys and gals who come up that way. And, people who get so influenced by it when they're younger that they pursue it as they get a little bit older. I don't think that's going anywhere. So I think the future of professional wrestling, once the world gets spinning again, I think it's pretty bright.
Okay. Steve, how about you?
Yeah, I think you see both. You asked about mixed martial arts and UFC and things like that. I think you see a lot of crossover, right? Tom Lawler, Ronda Rousey, Brock Lesnar did one, did the other, went back and forth. Bobby Lashley, who Demetrius just mentioned, did one and the other and back and forth. Dave Bautista went back and forth. There have been talks of guys like Chael Sonnen or Tito Ortiz coming into wrestling. So I really think there are people who would have gone right into wrestling in the 90s who might have gone into mixed martial arts now. But if they love wrestling, then I think they're going to end up doing wrestling at some point. Look at Gronkowski. Gronk just did WrestleMania because he's always wanted to do, wrestling. I think it might be Enes Kanter. There's an NBA guy who said he wants to do wrestling after he retires, right? So there's, I think there are athletes that love wrestling, and wrestling will become more of a second career, at least at the WWE giant draw level, for a lot of retiring athletes from other sports.
Gotcha. Great response. Tom, how about you?
I don't think it's really anything new. People moving from once, so-called mainstream sport into wrestling, like football, for example, has almost been somewhat of a feeder system into pro wrestling for a very long time. You go back and look at Ernie Ladd, played for the Dallas Cowboys, Cowboy Bill Watts, who was a wrestler and a promoter, huge football star at University of Oklahoma. Guys like Vader played for the LA Rams. Jinji Anvil Neidhart played for the Raiders. Are you going to go tell any of these guys they don't belong in wrestling? So it's not a real big surprise to me. But then, people who roll their eyes at that stuff now, probably don't know that specific history. Yeah. But, as far as the MMA crossover, I gotta agree with something Steve said. It's like, as far as, wanting to get into wrestling in the 90s, but then, now MMA is more of a thing than it was back then. So maybe that fits their skill set better. But you still see a lot of crossover, all the names that Steve mentioned, plus like Shayna Baszler and Marina Shafir and Jessamine Duke in WWE. And even somebody like Sonya Deville in WWE, who has an MMA background. So, you are seeing a lot of other athletes from other avenues coming into pro wrestling.
Yep, true. And again, it was just a question because, right now there's so many options now and so much available to people. Do you specialize, or can people specialize, or are they able to kind of maneuver back and forth between? So, all great responses. Before we wrap up, I do want to ask this question. I'm going to ask this question, and there will be a follow-up question that will close us out. Briefly, most overrated and most underrated wrestling characters that you've seen. I'm going to start with the man with the I don't want to answer this question face, don't put me on blast, Steve, and then we'll go with Tom and then Demetrius.
Wow,
overrated,
what? And it's not because I have like an answer in mind that it's a tough question.
Okay. I
would say the most overrated character. I think, gosh, that's tough.
Is there one that sticks out that's underrated, that you would say is underrated?
Yeah, I've got an overrated. I think overrated as far as exposed and pushed as a big star and wasn't really there. The Ultimate Warrior. As much as I liked the Ultimate Warriors, sorry, I liked Warrior. He's exciting, but if you watch him as an adult, you know, like there's nothing there. There's just nothing there. It's not exciting. The guy was a headache. So I'd say Ultimate Warrior is probably overpushed, overrated, underrated. And this is going to sound crazy because he became a big deal. CM Punk, because Punk was huge from 11 to 14 when he left. And everything about CM Punk being a smaller indie wrestling-based guy, him becoming a star opened the door for all of the guys that are stars now. Like everyone who's been a star the last few years in WWE, besides the few giants, besides Drew McIntyre, Braun Strowman, are all in the mold of CM Punk. Seth Rollins, John Moxley, Daniel Bryan. All of those happened because Punk broke through. And I don't think he'll ever get the credit he deserves because he and WWE left on such terrible terms. But you don't have this whole crop of guys if CM Punk does not break through the glass ceiling in 2011.
You know what? That's a great point. But let the record show that Steve has said that the Ultimate Warrior is overrated. We at Straight No Chaser, we encourage everyone to drink responsibly. that was strictly coming from the alcohol, I'm sure, because the Ultimate Warrior is a legend on these airwaves.
Well, I'm sorry, Warrior Nation, or whatever he said, his little warriors.
The little warriors like the Hulkamaniacs.
Yes.
It's funny because a guy that I was having a conversation with earlier, shout out to Dennis Sibbett. He was saying the Ultimate Warrior better get mentioned on today's show, and it's unfortunate that he gets mentioned on the most overrated. You know, shout out Dennis Sibbett.
I'm sorry, Dennis.
Don't worry, Dennis. I got you on the next one because the follow-up question, he's going to be on there. But yeah, that's interesting that you throw the Ultimate Warrior because he's one of my favorite wrestlers of all time. So interesting enough. Demetrius, how about you?
I would.
Demetrius was going to say it too, for the record. Demetrius was going to say it too.
I got your back, Steve. I got your back 100%. Ultimate Warrior was this jacked up, can't wrestle Nimrod. He opened his mouth and nonsense fell out. He made no sense. He looked like $1 million, but he made no sense as a character. And, you know.
Yeah, as JR would say, he was all sizzle, no steak.
100%. 100%. All sizzle, no steak. But he made a lot of money. He drew a lot of money. So the fact that he wasn't my batch of whiskeys, whatever. But, I think he was criminally overrated. As far as underrated, I love the CM Punk analogy. I'll stay in that same kind of lane with I was going to say Daniel Bryan, but he's notched some really great accomplishments in his time. But who I'm going to say is Zack Ryder. Zack Ryder was a guy who got into WWE at the age of like 20. And he kind of just threw him in a tag team with a friend of his. And then they partnered him up with Edge. And then he kind of floundered around. But then he took the initiative on himself to start doing some things outside of the WWE umbrella. He kind of created, in the earlier days of YouTube, kind of carved out his own niche, created a really good organic following for himself. And I'll never forget, I think The Rock was on TV. It was in Madison Square Garden. He was cutting a promo, and the crowd starts chanting, "We want Ryder." I don't even know if Ryder's even in the building. Yeah, wow, Rock's cutting a promo. I think he's got the belt over his shoulder, hyping up WrestleMania or something. But the people wanted Zack Ryder based on what Zack Ryder had done for himself. And that's huge. And he never really got his due, I don't think. He got a few moments here and there, but he was he just got released from WWE recently, but he had a nice 15-year run. Okay. While most of it was under the radar, but I felt like they left a lot of meat on the bone with him. But hey, he got paychecks for 15 years, so I guess I probably can't call him underrated. There's more paychecks from Vince McMahon than I'll ever see. So,
right.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to go on record to say, Dennis Sibbett, I tried. You know, I'm a Warrior fan myself, but we've got Rich Lang and also, let's see, we've got Rich Lang and Charlie Nachinsky. Rich Lang and Charlie Nachinsky who also agreed that the Ultimate Warrior is overrated. They've
For the record, those are both my friends.
both your friends.
Rich was my best man. Rich was my best man at my wedding, and Charlie is my co-host on the podcast.
Guys,
that
welcome to the show. Although
sense.
you'll never be on the show because you're Ultimate Warrior haters.
Hey, I agree with them. So.
Okay.
Stan, I'm going to send you some matches of like big guys who can actually work, and then we'll see what you think about Ultimate Warrior after. Well,
no.
Tom, Steve, I'll coach him up. We'll get him on.
Oh, we'll see. Once I get to mine, I think everybody's going to forget about that because
what's on you?
I guarantee you, my buddy Rich is going to turn on me for this one. But as far as overrated, as far as overexposure, I mean, definitely had, the charisma and the drawing power, but just too much, just always in your face, shoved down your throat, and it got very old at certain points. Hulk Hogan.
Yes.
I mean, I loved Hulk Hogan when I was a kid. I loved the whole Hulkamania thing. It lasted way too long.
Mm-hmm.
When he changed his character in '96, I loved it. It was great. But the original, the yellow and red, the Hulk Hogan, say your prayers, eat your vitamins, it got so stale after a little while.
Yeah.
And let's be honest, the guy couldn't wrestle his way out of a paper bag.
Yeah.
So, that's going to be my overrated is Hulk Hogan. As great as he was for the business, as much as he built the business up, it got to be too much. And as far as underrated, I'm gonna, kind of play off of what Steve said. He mentioned CM Punk and all the people that came after him. That Punk kind of opened those doors for him. One person that came along before that who would have thrived in that opportunity and just didn't get the chance was Dean Malenko.
I've heard that name.
I mean, fantastic technical wrestler. I mean, that's like my style that I love is the technical submission type wrestling. And Malenko was a master of it. And the only thing working against him was his size. He was like 5'8" and 180 pounds or something like that. At that time, the mid 90s, when he was at his peak, it just, when he moved to WWE, he kind of got lost in the shuffle. He never got any type of push to to get an opportunity at a main event level or anything like that. And I just think had he come along 10 years later, he would have been in that Daniel Bryan spot or that CM Punk spot or something like that. So underrated, definitely Dean Malenko.
So let me just say something. This Ultimate Warrior thing has struck a nerve with fans. Either you're polar opposites. Either you're pro Warrior or you're just your feelings a little.
Either you're pro Warrior or you just don't know any better.
Oh, okay, is that what it is?
You're either anti. If you like Warrior, it's just because you haven't seen enough wrestling since you were like 9. That's
I remember the game
probably
WrestleFest, and I used to use Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior as a tag team all the time. So.
Well, yeah, because in the video game they actually had wrestling moves.
But remember, it's all scripted. Remember. So Brenda O'Donnell says, "Sorry, son, but I still love the Warrior."
That's my mother.
I know. Rich Lang, you're an awful jackass. Charlie Nachinsky, not a Warrior hater, disagreeing. He's one of the most overrated people in wrestling. And by the way, I nailed the name. So, the Warrior, who would have known that the Warrior would have gotten the conversation going amongst fans. So great. I love to have the interaction and the feedback with the fans. The last question to take us out, and this is kind of going to be a difficult one, but the one that was going to be coming. Who is on your Mount Rushmore professional wrestling? Yes.
I've been thinking about this all day.
So let's start with you. It's been on your mind.
Yes, I've been thinking about this all day. So for me, it's guys who probably weren't the greatest wrestlers, but they really moved the needle.
Okay.
They took the business somewhere that it wasn't before them. And so, like Tom said, we have to begrudgingly give props to Hulkamania. Hulkamania was huge. Wrestling now wouldn't be what it is without WrestleMania, without Hulkamania. Just wouldn't happen. First couple WrestleManias, Hulk was in the main event every time. So that just speaks volumes. So he's on there. If you go back to wrestling back in the territory days, I would have to say the king of the territory wrestlers was Ric Flair.
Yes.
He's got a lot to do with the reason why I own this right here. He made this belt so cool along with everything else that he did. And plus, he was a huge draw. Like, Ric Flair could go to Fayetteville, Arkansas on a Wednesday and sell out against some local guy back in the day because he was just that good. My other Mount Rushmore guy would have to I have to say John Cena begrudgingly because John Cena came along during a time where the business was kind of plateauing, maybe even on a downward spiral. But he got himself to the top of the card and stayed there for a really long time, maybe too long. But you got to give him credit. He was able to have a run that most top guys don't get to have. My fourth guy, there's four on Mount Rushmore, right? There's four, right?
Yes. So one more.
This is going to be weird, but Gorgeous George.
Mm-hmm.
Gorgeous George wrestled in like the 40s and 50s,
Yeah.
making six figures.
Oh, wow.
Gorgeous George dyed his hair bleached blonde. A couple other wrestlers have done that since. Gorgeous George came to the ring in flamboyant robes and music. A couple other wrestlers have done that since. So I'd have to say, in terms of making money, setting the bar as far from an aesthetic standpoint, and I've probably never even seen a match, but just like his lore and the things that he did and what he was able to accomplish in the 30s and 40s. Can you imagine making six figures in like 1940 something? World War II, this man's making people come pay to see him wrestle. That's pretty incredible. So Gorgeous George, Hulk Hogan, Ric Flair, John Cena. That's my Mount Rushmore.
And you know what? We have, just real quick, I want to jump to the comments because we have someone who's chimed in with their Mount Rushmore. Charlie Nijinsky, Ric Flair, Hulk Hogan, Dusty Rhodes, and The Undertaker. Rick Lang, Hulk Hogan, I'm assuming Stone Cold Steve Austin, Ric Flair, and Bruno. Is that Bruno Sammartino?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. All good wrestlers, all I'm familiar with. Tom, how about you? And then Steve, I'll let you close out that question. Tom, how about you? Who's on your Mount Rushmore?
Okay, my Mount Rushmore, because I've put a lot of thought into this over a lot of time, and my Mount Rushmore, I always go by generation because wrestling is cyclical. It changes with every new generation that comes along, and just kind of by default, then my Mount Rushmore actually has 6.
Okay.
And because I take it way back. So
that has nothing to do with the new school math. It's just you take it way back. Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right.
I go through 6 very distinct generations of wrestling, and that first generation is what I refer to as the sporting era, the early 20th century, when professional wrestling was actually a sport. It was a competition. There was no kayfabe, there was no scripts, there was no predetermined finishes. It was like Olympic wrestling or something like that. It was one of the only organized professional sports that there were back then. There was no NFL, there was no Major League Baseball. You had golf, boxing was still illegal in a lot of places. You had horse racing and you had pro wrestling. Okay. And back then, the number one guy in the world was a guy named Frank Gotch. He was the first American to win the undisputed World Heavyweight Wrestling Championship. And in his era, he was the only person you could compare him to was Hulk Hogan, because he was that household name. He was in demand everywhere, retired undefeated as a champion. And so he was it. So he was like the first wrestling star. And then after that, you started getting into that kayfabe era where they were having the predetermined finishes because the promoters wanted to control the championships. And the person that kind of bridged that gap between those two eras was a guy named Lou Thesz.
Yes.
And just as a wrestler goes, he is still, in my book, probably the best wrestler. Actual mat wrestler to ever live. He was back then what was known as a hooker, not what we refer to as a hooker today, but a hooker as in
crazy.
A hooker as in what a hooker was back then was if somebody tried to pull a fast one on him and not, do what they were supposed to do during a match, he could tie you up and hurt you. So that's my number 2. Number 3 for me would be Bruno Sammartino. First WWE champion, or not the first WWE champion, I'm sorry, defeated Buddy Rogers to become the second WWE champion, held that title for 8 years. Sold out Madison Square Garden
Oh man.
thousands of times. And I mean, nobody will ever come close to his title reigns ever. And he was, you know, that again, he was that huge household name superstar. And then the next era moving into the 80s, of course, you got to say Hulk Hogan. You know, love him, hate him, whatever. He took wrestling into that mainstream level where you started seeing celebrities like Mr. T and Cyndi Lauper, and Liberace was at the first WrestleMania. I mean, so he's the one that. Yeah, he's Hulk Hogan's the one that took it to that next level as far as mainstream popularity. And then after that, you start getting into the Attitude Era, and Attitude Era was all about Stone Cold Steve Austin. You know, he to me is the top guy in WWE ever as far as merchandise sales, ticket sales, just, you know, the fans going nuts for him. He was it. He was the man. And then, you know, the next era after that, you know, what's referred to as like the PG era or whatever, would have to be John Cena, you know, because he's actually the last household name, huge, worldwide known superstar that WWE has produced, because they don't have one today. I talked about that earlier. They don't have one of those today. So yeah, that's mine. Frank Gotch, Lou Thesz, Bruno, Hogan, Stone Cold, and John Cena.
That's a great list. Can't argue too tough with any of those names, except maybe putting the Ultimate Warrior in there. I mean, but you know,
oh man,
hell no. To get past this Ultimate Warrior stuff, Stan. Really and truly.
Yeah, I loved Warrior when I was a kid.
Doing this.
All right. Oh, Steve, how about you? Closing us out on this question. How about you?
I'm going to go a different direction. I love Demetrius's Mount Rushmore. I love Tom's. And I think they're, you know, more, you know, all-time star appeal and all the package. And Tom, that was Demetrius's. Tom's was more generational. And I have thoughts on both of those too, but I'll go in a different direction. I will go Mount Rushmore. If I was booking a wrestling show and had a time machine, who are the 4 guys I would book on my wrestling show because they're just that good in ring, like in today's society?
Yes.
And I would say Ric Flair.
Yes.
Shawn Michaels.
Yes.
Kurt Angle.
Yes.
And Kenny Omega. Because the 4 of them, I think, represent different styles of wrestling, and all 4 are the total package. Character, mic work, in-ring work, look, it factor. And those 4, and you drop them in, you take Kenny Omega from 2019, you put him in 1979, he's a star. You take Ric Flair from 81, you bring him now, he's a star. I think those 4 are so good at what they do. They could be a star anytime, anywhere. So from a booker standpoint, that's my Mount Rushmore of dream guys I would put on my show.
And see, I think the way that you characterized it, the way you explained it, that's a great way to look at it, a great way to compile a list, and a great list that you were able to put together. It doesn't get any better than that. That's a great way to close us out with that question. So I do want to be mindful of everyone's time. We've had a great opportunity. This is a conversation that we can continue to have throughout the rest of the evening. We've had a great discussion here about wrestling, both independent, mainstream, a little bit of historical context, but then also discussion of current characters, things of that nature. This is something that we can continue to have. But I'd like to close us out with just thanking our guests for being on the show. Steve, can you just really quick share with our online community where they can find information about your wrestling promotions? I know once things open back up, you'll be up and going, but where they can find information about your wrestling promotions and where you have your events?
Absolutely. So our website is warriorwrestling.net. On Twitter and Instagram, we're at Warrior Wrestling, no vowels in wrestling. So WRSTLNG. We're on Facebook as well. And our shows are in Chicago Heights, Illinois, about 30 minutes south of downtown Chicago. And right now we are kicking around the idea of doing an outdoor show with social distancing guidelines once Illinois is in phase 4. So we're looking at the possibility that might come together, might not. But we're itching to have a show and welcome people down to Chicago Heights. So check us out at warriorwrestling.net.
Absolutely, and I will be there because you got me excited to come see some of the shows, and it's literally a stone's throw away from me. So thank you for sharing. Tom, how about you? Can you just, in closing, just share a little bit about your podcast and where it can be found?
Yeah, the podcast is called Catch, Hook, and Shoot. It drops every Sunday. It's on all podcasting platforms as well as on YouTube. yeah, you can find it on like Pandora, Spotify, iHeartRadio, anywhere, any place you find podcasts, you can find it. On social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, it's at Catch Hook Shoot, no and. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Like I said, I was lucky enough to get the same handle on every social media. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's
that can be a challenge.
every Sunday. I try to have it out before 5 p.m. Doesn't always happen, but it's out every Sunday.
Gotcha. Last but not least, Demetrius Payne, thanks for coming on the show. Any last words for our online community? I know you're walking around with the championship belt. You know, any last words for our online community?
Oh man, this has been a blast. I can talk wrestling. Whenever you want to do a show about wrestling, please let me know. Tom, Steve, it's great to meet you. Stan, I really appreciated being on, and this was great. And I guess my last words would be this: wrestling is real, people are fake.
Yes. What better way to close us out? Thank you to everyone. We're going to be ending our live stream, but thank you to everyone that's tuned in for the great comments, the fan feedback. Thank you to our guests, our panelists that have joined the conversation tonight. And remember, that's how we do a straight no chase. So thank you everyone for joining. Everyone be safe and take care.